point this silent, you'll be alone. Far from friends in life, you'll spend your evenings getting stoned to numb the ache inside.
So you had a good day?
Yeah. Great.
Good. Good. Mike, how was your day, man?
I got to figure out where my cameras are again. It was good. We actually celebrated my birthday early, so we went kayaking at up at a lake up north.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a good time.
Nice.
I enjoyed it.
That's it's funny because I called you earlier and I was like, I'm pretty sure his birthday is like today or tomorrow or
Close.
yeah.
What is your birthday again?
We're recording. I'm not saying that crap.
You could say Friday or Saturday. That doesn't mean
he could
shit.
say Monday, right?
That's
he could
true.
say it's
Publication
Monday.
day. It's on Monday. Yeah.
Okay. All right, good.
Yeah. So happy birthday, Mike.
Happy birthday, Mike.
Cheers. Thanks.
You're almost
I'm gonna-
really old.
I'm so security. I'm like, nope. If anybody goes back through this, they're like, okay, we know your name, your birthday. We're gonna open up a bank account.
He's older than me, so that's all I know. So
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Wait, what?
Yeah, man.
Mike's older than me. Yeah.
I'm
But I
older than
came up-
half of that class. The one that was above that graduated ahead of
Mike
us.
should have been in my
Yeah.
class. I should have been in your class.
That's hilarious.
I
knew that.
Yeah,
knew
I
you
was
were
held
supposed to
back
be-
for a year
yeah.
because cognitive reasons.
Well, clearly that hasn't been solved yet. So
Nope.
I don't even think they got medicine for that yet.
Oh, that's interesting. So I don't know. I've been like thinking about what we're going to talk about tonight, and I told you thinking about some questions.
Sure.
I just kind of wanted to start out. So I had a conversation earlier this week with the therapist, and she's currently working on becoming like a licensed gambling therapist.
God, I need to talk to her.
Do you?
I'm just kidding.
I mean, you know.
But maybe.
Well, okay, so that we can avoid this topic if we need to, JP. I mean,
Trigger warnings.
Yeah. No, so we were talking, and one of the things she brought up was the part of men are disproportionately represented in gambling addiction,
Mhm.
and we talked about it, and part of it is due to guys' propensity to be more risk tolerant.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of wanted to ask you guys, like, what do you think of, like, why do you guys think that is? Like, not necessarily in the gambling piece, but like, why do you guys think that, or do you guys think that guys are more risk tolerant than women? Is it a male female thing, or I don't know? What do you guys think?
I love this question. I love this question so much. I'm going to divert to Mike first because I know I've got so much to say on this. Go for it, dude.
I think men are typically more risk tolerant than women
Yes. Yeah.
by necessity, though.
Okay, so expand on that.
Okay, so if we're looking at like stereotypical roles that men and women have to fill,
Sure.
right? If men are typically the providers and the protectors, those two domains come with a lot of risk to be successful. To be successful in providing, you have to take risks. Big risks usually equal big rewards,
Yeah.
right? So being conservative in business efforts or in even like conflicts are usually not rewarded proportionally, right? Like are disproportionately. So if you want to become a very successful person, you have to do something that others are not willing to do. Is one aspect of looking at. The other aspect of looking at it is it's a risky business going out of the cave every day, trying to kill something, drag it home, just by the nature of the thing.
Mhm.
Us going out and trying to provide with a job and putting ourselves out there is actually putting yourself out there at risk on some level. And so that's what it is. And then again, to the protector aspect, it is a risky business by pure definition to protect somebody because you have to be in the way of something that's trying to cause harm to somebody else. So you have to be more risk tolerant in order to fulfill those roles. But I could probably expound a little more, but that's not really necessary.
I want to get your thoughts, because I want to follow up to that. But what are your
No,
thoughts?
I agree. I think there's kind of two parts to it, right? So I think like what Mike said is very accurate in that when you look at just kind of, and I don't want to say gender roles is like a good term for it, But if you look at just overall genuine, like if you look at just, if you break apart masculinity versus femininity in general,
Yeah.
and I guarantee you, if you pull anybody on this, right? Women by nature seek, and this is not like a knock on anything, right?
Yeah.
But women by nature seek stability, security, safety stuff, right?
Yep.
So that's a woman, true femininity gets released in a safe environment, right? Because
That's good.
they have that safety, they have that security to now be comfortable in who they are. And that's exactly what a man's supposed to provide. If you look at like just genuine like job market in general, right?
Yeah.
Men are expected typically to put more of a face mask on to kind of present in a certain way.
Right.
In a way that I don't think women typically are. Like the presentation, both roles present, but they're very different presentation types, right?
Right.
And so if you look at like a masculine role, like the male, like a true like masculine role typically is deemed, whether and this is not based off anybody's opinions, but just based off of just historical evidence, right? Is that the masculine is typically expected to like provide, to stabilize, to not to nurture, but to like
Protect.
and create space, right?
Yeah.
So a man's role historically has been to create almost like a bubble, right? It's a very exterior, very kind of like you're facing the outer elements. Whereas if that's functioning in a healthy manner, the feminine role is to create the space within the space.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so I think most men genuinely, if they're functioning in their masculinity, and most women will typically identify with this, is you're creating space for the woman to be herself.
Yeah.
So you're creating an outer shell for this, right? And if that outer shell is protective enough, if it's safe enough, then she starts becoming comfortable within that space. And that's where the nurturing and everything comes into place, which is where you start getting into like child rearing and everything like that, right?
Right.
So if we're getting back to the original thought of like masculinity from like a gambling
Sure.
addiction type role, right? there's because you're operating on the outer elements of that space, there's much more risk involved with that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think healthy masculinity has a innate degree of risk involved with it.
Yeah.
But when you start talking about like gambling addictions and therapy and stuff like that, I think you're starting to talk about the outer elements, right? And so
Right.
you're talking about the fringe masculinity, which
Right.
is where a man, and this is just my experience. So I've played poker for a long time, right? And so poker's been my game of choice. It's been a thing that I've vehemently passionate about. It's probably my go-to. Just I wouldn't even say like a release as much as it is like I love the experience of poker.
Yeah.
Because poker is so much a understanding of people.
Yep.
Right. And
Yep.
so, and you see like a full spectrum of people within that space. And I think, and it is definitely more masculine than feminine. Like you get way more men playing poker than women who are playing poker. Right. And so,
God, that's so sexist, JP.
I know it is. women come play poker. Tiff, you need to come play poker more. But seriously though, when I sit at a poker table with people, like you can tell the guys that I'm trying to figure out how to say this, but like you can tell the guys that need to prove themselves, right? And it's not so much like I don't want to say it's completely born out of insecurity, but I think there's an insecurity factor with it.
Yeah.
And the higher the insecurity, the higher the risk required to compensate for that insecurity, right? And so when you have, I think as a man, when you have really innate security in yourself,
Yeah.
the less risk you have to take on because you're more comfortable with that.
Huh.
Right. I don't think that's necessarily like, and I'm not saying that men shouldn't seek risk. They should seek security.
Yeah.
But I think by law of nature, I do think the more risk prone man there is, typically the more insecurity you're going to find in that man with him. and it's not necessarily like a always a like a hatred of self type insecurity.
Right.
But it is kind of like a, maybe you didn't feel like you proved something at this point in your life.
Right.
You need to assert yourself in this manner, right? So
Right.
men that are more assertive in that space typically do. So it's why I think men that gravitate towards like gambling addictions and stuff like that usually feel like they have something more to prove. And I think it's not necessarily something that's like biologically wrong with them. I think
Right.
it's biologically by design, is because
Mm.
if men are designed to operate in the fringes of space,
Yep.
then it's, you have to figure out how to get to those fringes and how not only how to operate in those extremes,
Yeah.
but also like how do you settle into those extremes, right?
Right.
You either, sometimes you can get in that space and you can overcorrect, or maybe you're in the middle of the space, you don't feel like you're really hitting those fringes and you really need to prove yourself with this
Yeah.
stuff, which is why I think men tend to gravitate to those stuff. I don't think women tend to gravitate towards that stuff because they don't operate in the fringes as much. And it is kind of like poker, just like, or gambling in any form is a bit of adrenaline rush, right?
Yep.
And so you've got a lot more, anytime you're talking about adrenaline, you're talking about a higher boost of testosterone, which is innately not something that you're going to find more in women than men.
Sure.
So I think biologically it is kind of driven that way, but yeah.
Do you guys think that, because what I hear you guys saying is that because of, just to restate it, because of where men have to operate, they have to be okay with risk.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have to take some risk. Do you guys think that when you talk about like a man who's confident and competent versus a man who is, having to prove something, you feel like he's out there just trying to prove himself. Do you think that a guy who is confident and comfortable and doesn't feel the need to prove himself, do you think that he takes risk, or is it more of he knows what he's doing and so he's operating from a sense of security?
I've got an
Does that
answer
make
on
sense?
but yeah. No, I think I know what you're saying. I think there's 2 degrees of risk, right?
Yep.
And that is, I think men by design either take on risk because they're trying to prove something to other people
Mm-hmm.
or themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very driven either externally or internally. And so I think a lot of guys, I don't think necessarily taking on risk is a form of insecurity.
Okay.
But I think it's where you draw your source from. If you don't feel like you're measuring necessarily up,
Yep.
then I think it's more natural to take on risk because you're trying to prove it externally. I still think guys that are very secure will still take on risk.
Yeah.
But not necessarily because they're trying to prove it to other people,
Right.
but because they know themselves
Mm-hmm.
and they're proving it to themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think risk is necessarily a bad thing. I don't want to necessarily associate it with like, if you're taking on risk, you're just an insecure dude, right?
Right.
But it is definitely driven on like, why are you taking on risk and stuff? And if you're risk averse, right?
Right.
That doesn't necessarily coincide with being a bad thing or a good thing. Like you might be risk averse because you see yourself as very secure. You're very happy with who you are.
Right.
You're not worried about like proving anything to anybody.
Right.
And so maybe you're not taking on risk because you're like, yeah, like I don't really need to prove this. But on the flip side of it, you could also be risk averse because like, oh, what if I fail and I look like an idiot to people?
Yeah.
I'm risk averse because out of fear, right?
Right.
So I think there is a kind of a spectrum to all of it.
Yep.
I think it just kind of depends on like where you kind of fit. That's my personal opinion. I think guys fit in so I guess like breaking down based off what you're saying, I would almost put guys into 4 different categories. You're either risk prone, risk averse.
Yep.
If you're risk prone out of insecurity or security. And if you're risk averse, you're risk averse out of security and security.
Okay.
Right? So it's almost a quadrant that you build off.
Yeah.
I'm curious, could you be secure and like to seek risk? Like I'm trying to think through all the reasons why certain people seek risk, and sometimes, like even gambling, it's not necessarily a security or insecurity or even like the gains. Sometimes, like you said earlier, like the adrenaline rush you get when taking a risk.
Well, I think it goes back to that quadrant, and just kind of building in my mind. I think it is either you're risk prone or risk avert.
Mm-hmm.
or you're either secure and insecure. Risk prone and secure are typically going to be males that are very confident in themselves but want to push themselves. So these are going these are going to be your men that are very ambitious, but not out of a lack of validity in their masculinity, right? So these are going to be guys that maybe grew up with like healthy male role models that feel confident in themselves and everything. They don't necessarily look down on other people, but they want to push themselves to different heights, right?
Right.
Those are going to be guys that accept different, like higher levels of risk. Risk prone but insecure are going to be guys that probably had like poor male modeling in their early like youth, didn't see that, wanted to prove it to their dads or their uncles, whoever that male model was that didn't make them feel accepted in life. They're going to try to use risk as a vehicle to fill that insecurity that they developed, right? And on the flip side, I think it's the exact same opposite, is you can be risk prone but insecure, right? And you can be risk prone or risk avert and insecure. So if you're risk avert and insecure, then you've probably had a lot of really rough experiences, right? Maybe a lot of damage. There's some trauma that you're working through with stuff, male figures. There's probably a heavy dose of fear and trauma involved in life. And so again, I think it just kind of depends on like what your life experience was, but also like what you're also using risk as. Like, is risk your vehicle to prove something to somebody else, or is risk your vehicle just to prove something to yourself? So,
no, that's a great way to conceptualize it. I think as I was thinking about this, I think risk is, as you guys have talked about, it's absolutely necessary for men.
Yeah.
Like I don't think that you can, I'd say, prove yourself without taking some risk, right? You have to step out as we move into manhood. I think we have to take risk. It just really is it healthy risk or is it unhealthy risk? And I think of it from the perspective of my boys, and I see some tendencies in a couple of my sons, to be a little bit more hesitant to take some risk. And so it's like, okay, how do I help them identify healthy risk to take versus unhealthy risk? Because I think as parents, we want to protect our kids. Like we don't want them to run out in the street and get hit by a car, right? But we also want them to be able to be confident enough to go out and play, down the road.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do we balance that, especially with like, raising young men, or if we're mentoring men? How do you guys think, like, how do we balance that? Because it's very easy to go really far one way or the other. The hardest part is to be in that kind of middle spot where it's like, okay, these are the right times to take risk. Because and it's always different, right? Like it's very situational, I think. And so I don't know, what do you guys think about, like, how do we help others or even ourselves, like, identify what's good risk?
Can I ask a question for clarification?
Yep.
It's really only for my sake, actually. Are we talking about like actual risk, or are we talking about pushing your comfort zone? Because like I feel like a child can push those two. Those two could be seen very similar to a young adult or a child, right? But the perception is very different once you've obviously understood what a comfort zone is versus an actual risk. Like when I ride a motorcycle 167 miles an hour, that's a real world risk. That's not a comfort zone necessarily. I can be very comfortable, but there is a higher risk level, right? Versus when I was younger, asking a girl out, the reality of things, it's a very low risk in the sense of safety, but it's a high risk in the sense of like, I could fail at this and I'm uncomfortable doing it. So like, it's kind of, when you talk about kids, that's kind of where my brain goes. I'm like, I'm trying to figure out which terms are we going with.
Yeah. I mean, I was more talking about Risk, the board game, but you know,
Axis and Allies for the win.
No, that's a great point.
Sorry, yeah, it's more
I don't know if I differentiate those though, because
that's fair.
I think risk is really individual, right? Because there are times when stepping out and doing something out of your comfort zone is risky, right? It could. So, for instance, if you have to, if you have a boss who's really overbearing and is maybe, not either getting your way of getting stuff done because they're micromanaging, or they're taking you down the wrong path. Like let's say you see them taking your team in a direction that's going to be detrimental. It is going to be out of your comfort zone probably to go to your boss and say, "Hey man, or lady,
Yeah.
this is I think this is wrong." Right?
Yeah.
Is there a lot of risk involved in that? Yeah, probably there could be, right? Depending on your relationship with that person. So I think that I don't necessarily differentiate the two just because it's going to be perceived risk, right? I think it's what you view in that moment as risky.
Okay, that checks my. Okay, thanks. I appreciate you
Yeah.
doing that. 'Cause I'm trying to figure out what's the question being asked and where it's coming from, and like that makes more sense to me.
And I think too, the other thing of it is when I think of risk, it's like, okay, I am now entering a spot where I am looking to gain something, but my loss is maybe outside of what I want it to be or what I'm okay with.
Yeah.
Right. Which is probably more the definition of risk itself. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on like how do we breed a healthy amount of risk in guys? Because again, for me personally, like I fall more into that, like I don't take as many risks, right? And or at least with some things. And I think one of the things I want to get better at is because I push myself like outside of my comfort zone. And I don't have a problem with that. But I do have a problem. I don't want to say a problem, but like I do want to be better at taking good, healthy, calculated risks, because I think that, and maybe it's just me personally, I think that there is benefits that I haven't gotten from my, the career, let's say, because maybe I've hesitated in taking risks. So, what are you guys thoughts on, how do we help people take healthy risks, or how do we identify a healthy risk?
I think from what I'm hearing is I feel like the important distinguishing factor here is difficulty and risk, right? And that's where I really kind of distinguish, especially when you're talking about raising children and stuff like that. I don't love pushing risk onto children.
Okay.
I like pushing difficulty onto children, because I think, and what I'm really kind of saying, I guess, with this is like risk is return on investment.
Yep.
Right. That's really like what like the baseline of risk is the more risk you take, the higher return on investment, which they typically float like simultaneously, like or parallel with each other, right? The higher the risk, the higher the potential return on investment, right? And so when you're talking about like stuff with risk with kids, I'm and Mike and I have had this conversation before. And Mike, I don't want to like paraphrase like anything he said, correct me if I'm wrong, but like Mike has always identified himself as like more risk avert and me more risk prone. I don't see myself as risk prone, and I don't see Mike necessarily as risk avert, honestly. I just think we both have healthy understandings of levels of risk, but different tolerances for that risk necessarily. But like when we're talking about risk, again, like, let me just kind of clarify like risk overall. For me, risk in my life might be playing poker, right? But what am I also risking? I've never been a person that goes out and plays for like bank accounts and bottom dollar. Like I'm not trying to empty anybody's pockets. I'm not trying to take anybody's pink tags. I'm not trying to take anybody's rent or mortgage payments.
Right.
Like that's not what I play for. Right. And so when I go play poker, I only play at a level that I'm very comfortable with leaving. And this is again, my personal just kind of view on it is like gambling is something that I'm definitely very familiar with. I've had friends that have really struggled with that stuff. People that I've played with, and it's something that I'm very like, I've learned to be very careful with it. Gambling in the same sense of like drinking or anything like that. Right? Like I have no problem having a beer,
right? But
I'm also not going to go out and try to like have like I'm not going to meet up with somebody that I know has struggles with alcoholism or anything like that at a bar, right? And so it's to me, gambling is much more. And I get that it can spin very much out of control. There's definitely people in across the spectrum, I would say,
right.
On this, but I've never played with people typically that play for like rent or mortgage money or anything like that, right? And
Right.
so if I'm worried about somebody losing their potential to provide for their family, I'm not going to play that game.
Hmm.
So I'm taking on risk when I play anytime. I'm taking on what I consider acceptable risk,
Yeah.
right? And that is something that is not going to impact me
Yeah.
financially in
Yeah.
any way outside of maybe like smaller investments, right?
Yeah.
And so when I go play with somebody or when I'm playing with anybody, I don't want to ever be playing with anybody that I feel like they're taking on a level of risk that could potentially harm them.
Right.
So when you're talking about risk, like it's more, again, I think the innate nature of risk is you are betting on something that most likely won't have, like the higher, by definition, the higher level of risk, the
Yeah.
lower probability that's going to happen, right?
Right.
So you have to bet on things that you are willing to accept as a loss that's not going to impact you in a negative way, but could potentially change things greatly in a
Yeah.
very positive way. So it's all about balancing what that risk is.
Yeah.
People that don't necessarily want to play that game, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think those are people that it all typically balances out, right? If you really look at, I would bet if you looked at overall numbers of people that take on heavy levels of risk,
Yeah.
and people that don't take on risk, it's a wash at the end. Because I think people that don't take on risk typically float on the average, right?
Yeah.
People that do take on risk, you're going to have a higher proportion that do get that risk
Yeah.
and a much lower proportion that don't, right? Because
Right.
they are taking on the loss of the lower
Right.
end of the spectrum, right?
Right.
And so when somebody says like I'm risk averse or anything, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not profitable in life or anything like that. It just
Right.
means that they're not necessarily gambling at the levels that other people are. And a lot of people take those losses, right? And so when we're talking about risk as far as children, I don't think of risk when I think of kids.
Yeah.
I don't ever want my kids to take on risk or anything like that. Like I want them to be later on in life where they're established, where
Sure.
they can take on that risk.
Sure.
Difficulty is different though, is I want my kids to have, and I don't want to make their lives difficult,
Right.
but I want them to be able to experience difficulty in their life to be able to overcome that, because
Yep.
there's difference between risk and difficulty, and risk is about taking a bet and a gamble on something that you're willing to lose, right?
Yeah.
Difficulty is just taking on something that's hard to do but you could potentially prove, right? So if you're talking about kids like trying to, make the varsity basketball team,
Yeah.
or to get to college and get a scholarship, or like whatever, fill in the blank, whatever it is, right? They're pushing themselves to a level that most people don't get to.
Right. Yeah.
And so they're taking on they're not taking on a risk so much as they're just facing difficulty.
Sure.
Right. And so like in my mind like from a parenting standpoint, especially from a masculine parenting, like a fatherly standpoint, it's like, how do you allow your kids to face difficulty, but also walk with them through it and help them understand like what life looks like in reality?
Yeah.
Because really at the end of the day, and I think I talked about this last time we were talking, but at the end of the day, the people that really make it far in life, the number one attribute of anybody, and I don't even want to use the word successful, but the number one attribute of anybody that makes it to wherever they want to be is consistency.
Right.
And it's just, how consistent are you in life? Are you consistent with your bill, with your money? Are you consistent with your family? Are you consistent with your relationships? Are you consistent? Like the higher level of consistency that you have with things.
Sure.
And this is where I would say I don't know if I would go risk, but like the higher level of difficulty you open yourself up to,
Yeah.
the further you're probably going to get in life. Right.
Yeah. Mike, did you have anything you wanted to chime in on?
I actually I like a lot of what JP said, but I do think I come at it from a slightly different, at least in relation to kids, right? Because when I
Yeah.
think risk,
Yeah.
like JP said, I'm very risk averse in some aspects. Then I sat here and I was thinking about it while you're talking. I'm like, I go rock climbing, mountain biking, skiing.
Exactly.
I don't know if I'd consider myself risk averse after knowing what I've done.
Sure.
But then you look at my career decisions, my financial decisions, and it very much echoes the sentiments of what kind of things I saw in my childhood. You were mentioning a lot of people are risk averse. It tends to be like the environments that they grew up in, right? Can dictate that. Mine was very financially unstable. So my financial life is extremely risk averse. So it's really stable, my baseline. However, my hobbies are very, very go for broke. So then when I'm saying all that, because when you start asking about how do we build that in kids, ironically, I put them in front of danger instead of difficulty necessarily. So I take kids rock climbing as by far my favorite thing to do, because there is an actual risk of injury. You're going to get hurt if you aren't slowing yourself down and thinking this through.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And I like that as an avenue, because when I sit there and talk to them, like, your brain and your body are going to tell you to do one thing and it's going to get you hurt.
Yeah.
I need you to slow down. I need you to get control of your brain and think through what the actual ramifications of what you're going to do are, how badly you can get hurt, and then think through every motion that you're going to take to ensure that that does not happen.
Right.
Yep.
And through that process of giving them the control, like, I'm going to put you in a risky situation, but I'm going to give you the tools to control the outcome as best as you can.
Sure.
Not saying it's going to fully work, right? But it is if you do these things, like, all right, you have 3 points of contact. Are they solid? Did you test it? Good. Right. Is your anchor bomber? Is it not? Are you accepting that risk or not? Right? Did you do your anchor correctly? Is your rope tied off properly?
Right.
These things where they can start to understand that they have control over a level of the risk.
Right.
And they are making the calculations themselves of assuming, like, I know what the outcome is if I'm wrong here. Do I proceed? Yes or no? And then if I do, how? I like that, because it is a difficulty, but it's a real risk. I've had kids, like, they get scared on the wall. They don't want to come. Like, if they slip and fall, they scratch up their knees, which is minimal from the routes I'm putting them on. But I like that aspect, at least, because I do it with my daughters, right? And I find with them, they're much more emotional than I am, and it gives them opportunity to be like, okay, you need to control your emotion and understand the risk. Now I need you to think through it on a very, like, logical level, and think through what you're going to do and what each step's risk is. So that's how I approach kids with expanding the risk. And, like, Zoe's a good example. She's gotten much better with it, but it is also a very different kind of risk than, like, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about with, like, career or financial or other things. And I don't know if
is it different though?
I don't know. That's what I don't know if it translates. I don't know if that one skill translates over, right? Like, I can do some things that are risky, but I can't also do other things that are.
Well, I think that the biggest distinguisher in what you just said, and this is where I'll give tons of props to Mike and Tiff. Thank you, Tiff. Even though you're off camera, is, like, one of the things that I probably learned from them from a parenting standpoint very early that I was doing wrong. Was, and I don't want to say it's necessarily like helicopter parenting or anything, but you do as a parent, like your natural instinct as a parent is to step in and take care of your kids, like especially as a man. Like,
you want to protect
your design is, like, how, like, what kind of space am I providing for my family? Like, how safe did my wife feel? How safe did my kids feel? Like, are they in a space where they can function and operate and everything? And so it's very easy as a man to step in there and be like,
take the risk for them.
You take on, well, not, you don't
take it away.
Actually, you take the risk away from them. And you want to provide a risk-free environment for them to be able to go through. And I think that's the biggest challenge from a male standpoint is you have, like, it's almost against our nature in form,
right?
Is that, like, you have to find as a man, like, comfortable levels of risk to put your family and your kids through. Right. And that's where, like, I think Mike and Tiff have really excelled is just kind of talking about, like, the stuff that they do with their kids. Like I remember one of the first, and this is my hats off moment to you guys, but one of, like, the first, like, moments that I saw, like, this kind of in action was when we first started going skiing with the kids and stuff like that, right? And I remember this was before, like, Lee and I had been very hardcore, like, our kids aren't doing technology, they're not doing, like, we're not doing phones, like, screw the social norm and everything. Our kids are going to grow up the exact same way that we grew up and everything like that. And there's this, like, massive social detachment from technology that we were dealing with. And then as soon as they started going skiing, it was like, oh yeah, we let the kids kind of go on the mountain, we give them walkie-talkies and they keep in touch with us and stuff. Like, we're like, oh, like, the kids are just going off by themselves. And I remember having a real conversation with Lee about this, of just being like, oh, like, our kids are up in the mountains with, like, Mike and Tiff, and they might be, like, on their own. And we're like, are we okay with that? And, like, we were not okay with it at the time. But at the same time, it wasn't necessarily Mike and Tiff that we weren't comfortable with. It was just like, we don't know if we've, like, prepared our kids to be ready for this. Right? And and going through that and stuff, it was like, oh, like they can actually function like this. They can actually do this really well. And so now, like when I go with the boys, we take walkie-talkies. They go, like, if I'm not with them and stuff like that, still, like, they've got their little walkie-talkies. They can keep in touch with me and stuff like that. We talk about, we communicate, we regroup and stuff like that. And you train your kids up into, like, you again, like as a parent in general, you give your family bubbles and boundaries to work within.
Yeah.
But your goal, if you're doing it right, your goal is to make those as big as possible, right?
Yeah.
So you always want to be operating as fringe as possible of like, what can my kid handle? Like, what can they do?
Right.
And if they prove to you that they can't handle it, then you shrink that bubble.
Yeah.
You know, and you make sure it's in that space and everything, but you let them get to that point where they can push it. And when they push it, you push it a little bit further. Like,
right.
what else can they do? What else can they handle?
Right.
Because you're teaching them to function in those spaces and everything. And so that's where I like it from a difficulty standpoint. I'm very pro, like, not introducing difficulty, making your kids' life difficult,
right,
but like allowing them to function through difficulty.
Right.
But from a parenting standpoint, also like taking that, like, I feel like the difficulty is more putting the difficulty on the kids. The risk is more on the parents.
Yeah.
And the risk is more about like, what level of risk are you willing to accept?
Yeah.
Functioning like that. Right.
Man, this is why I think it's so important for guys to really understand we are the ones that need to be able to not only take on risk, but teach risk.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that, because I really think through, when I think of risk, I also link it to boldness.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just immediately where I go. Because when I see people who are more risk prone, or risk tolerant, I would call them pretty bold.
Yeah.
Right. Like I see them charge, and sometimes, right, sometimes it's not the smartest thing, right? Sometimes the people that are out front charging, the first one charging into battle, yeah, you're probably getting shot down, buddy. Like, I appreciate your bravery and all that stuff. You can be my human shield. I'll run right behind you.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, I do kind of link those two. And I think it's so important for us, especially as men, because I think we are generally more tolerant, right? There's actually Cambridge last year posted something. I just wanted to read it really quick. It just kind of supports this idea. So they kind of did a review on some of the studies out there. They said the existence of gender differences in propensity to take risks has been documented in a large number of questionnaire and experimental studies. For example, a meta-analysis by Brines, Miller, and Schaefer reviewed over 150 papers on gender differences in risk perception. They concluded that the literature clearly indicated that male participants are more likely to take risks than female participants. And so I see that as we have kind of a responsibility to help our families learn how to take on appropriate risk, which I think then leads to boldness in life.
Yeah.
And it then breeds confidence and competence, because when you can walk into situations that are maybe unknown, like we all have that, we get invited to, I don't know, a networking event, or, somewhere where we don't know anybody, or we don't have any comfort because it's, an event that we've never been to, or, it's a situation that we aren't familiar with. And there's a feeling of like, oh, I'm a little anxious, right? I feel like those who have a good idea of how to take on healthy risk, it produces a boldness in them that they can then walk into situations like those and be more comfortable. Mm-hmm. Not that they don't experience anxiety, not that they don't, deal with those same kind of emotions, but I think they know how to deal with those, and they can appropriately judge where they should be, where they shouldn't be.
I think instead of saying I'm more comfortable, like just on this one, is like they're not more comfortable. They're just as uncomfortable, but like you said, they have the tools and they're prepared to enter into something that's uncomfortable for them and deal with that situation. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would say there is, and I want to be careful saying this, but
no, be reckless. Take a risk.
Based off what you're saying. Based off what you're saying, I think there is a healthy level of confidence that goes along with risk, right? And
yeah.
But again, I think I wrestle with the idea of risk, just because, again, risk is the, like, if you were just to tell somebody taking on risk, they could be doing it very foolishly and they could be doing it very wisely, right? You can take on a healthy degree of risk and be doing it very wisely, and you can take on a healthy degree of risk and be doing it very foolishly. I think a lot of it's your confidence and things.
Okay.
And I do think there is a level of overconfidence that can exist with that, so you got to be careful with it.
Yep.
But I do think at the end of the day, I do think risk kind of boils down to how confident you are in solving problems.
Yeah.
And if you are confident in solving problems, if you're confident in working through things, the higher level of confidence you have in working through those problems, the higher level of risk you're willing to accept, right? So for example, I could sit there and I'll just use, again, going back to a poker analogy or something like that, right? If I go through and play poker for like $500 and I play with other dude who's playing for $500, right? My mindset can be, if I lose $500, I can replace that $500 like that, right?
Yep.
So $500, whatever. I can make $500 like that.
Sure.
Not worried about it.
Yep.
Right. So I'm willing to take the potential advantage of what I could do with that $500.
Yep.
And if I lose $500, I know I'm very confident in my ability to replace that $500.
Sure.
The other guy can be playing that $500 and be thinking, if I lose that $500, I'm at $500. I don't know how I'm going to replace that $500.
Right.
So I do think confidence kind of rolls into it. I think the dangerous part is that again, it's a very I would say it's a very psychological thing, and I don't know if I'm really well qualified to kind of talk on that portion. Sure. But you've got to be careful because, again, it kind of goes back to I genuinely believe in this like quadrant of
every time you talk about it, I think about like in science class with like the traits, the inherited traits, right? The dominant, non-dominant, big T, big
I know
T,
guys,
little T, little
I know
T.
guys that would be like 100% confident going in, betting their asses off on this stuff.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden just be like, oh, I just lost like everything I own and stuff. Like what the crap? Now they're scrambling for stuff. It's like, no, like you have to, there's still a balance with this stuff.
Yeah.
But it is, again, I think there's confidence, but there's also delusional confidence that you got to be careful of, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you're truly confident in yourself and stuff like that, then you can accept higher degrees of risk and stuff like that with life.
Sure.
And I do agree. I do agree. I think when you're talking with kids, like I want my kids to be able to take on risk as much as they want in life.
Yeah.
But I want them to be able to take on risk because they're confident, not in the outcome of the risk,
right,
but in their ability to overcome whatever the outcome is of the risk.
Oh, that's good.
Right.
Yeah, that's
good.
And
so like I want them to know that no matter what the outcome of that risk is, they can move it forward. The term that keeps coming to head, I'm not gonna mention the whole, it's FITFO. I don't know if you've ever heard that terminology. Mm-hmm. Figure it the F out.
Yep.
But it's basically just this idea of like, hey, like I can get through, like no matter what happens, I can figure this out.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think when you have that mentality and when you have kids that are very healthy in that way of life, they can push themselves in areas that most kids typically can't. Sure. Because they're willing to not only accept the risk that they're taking on, like what the potential outcome is,
yeah,
but also like if things don't work out, they're very confident in themselves to be able to work through those things.
Yeah.
Right.
So you might say then that a healthy amount of risk is balanced out by a person's resiliency.
Correct. Yeah.
Because and it's interesting because resiliency is tied into so many different things. Ironically, resiliency is actually one of the number one protective factors for suicide.
Yeah.
And you know, again, if you talk about risk taking, if you can take on that risk, but you know, regardless of the outcome, you can overcome that, right? Mm. And I, you know, obviously there's some one-off scenarios where you can't, you know, like if you die.
Not much to do about that. Yeah.
If you're okay with that, like I look at guys like Alex Honnold, right?
Yes.
That dude, number one, I'm like scared of heights. So watching free solo for me was just an experience in of itself. I was like, I'm like sweating watching that movie. But also I'm just going like, dude, this guy is so like just risk tolerant. Like he's just up there and I don't know, like thank you Google for continually feeding me that because I've looked it up and now I see all of the things that he's free soloing.
Yeah.
But it's crazy because he's continually doing it. But I mean, to that point, like he has the resiliency to know, right? Like regardless of the outcome, he's okay with the outcome.
Yeah.
I need to show you a video on that exact note.
Okay.
Because there's some things with Alex Honnold that are also a little atypical.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
But that shows you a great example of there's a video of him climbing in Las Vegas with Magnus Mitbo. He's like a professional climber who does YouTube videos. Well, they met up and they were going to do a climb, and then Honnold convinces him to do a solo, like a free solo.
Yeah.
So those of you who don't know what a free solo is, it means you are going up with no aid except for your shoes. So no ropes.
Right.
So if you fall all the way down.
Yeah,
There's
you're
nothing
done.
catching.
It's a one and done.
In that experience, watching that recording puts you into this perspective of Magnus is an extremely accomplished climber. He can easily climb this route. It's well within his skill level. And you see the psychological battle he is going through, like very blatantly on camera. Yeah. And you just see how Alex is sitting there just like, oh yeah, you got it. I'm chilling. I'm eating while you see this. So it's a very interesting effect. So like I wouldn't use Alex as a good metric of resiliency because there's something different about him. But watching the resiliency that Magnus has, it really is that like I am pushing my limits and I am having to do these things that will calm myself down and stay in control of myself in a very difficult situation. It's very interesting. I think
to Tim's point though, and actually to both your points, I guess, is that when you talk about risk, like I'm not trying to bring it back to necessarily the parenting standpoint, but like I'm less concerned about my kids' affinity for risk in their lives at a young age, more so their ability to push themselves through difficulty, right?
Yeah.
And so because like if you're talking about like Alex Honnold and stuff like that, like you're talking about, again, like we're talking about the fringes of humanity, right?
Yeah.
And so these are people that have accepted levels of risk that none of us would accept, right? And so it's not that it's anything wrong with it,
right?
You know, at the same time, like I would never be Alex Honnold. I'd never want that level of risk. I also don't want to be the dude in the basement sitting on a couch for his rest of life that's afraid to walk upstairs because he's afraid to break his ankle or something like that, right? Like there's a spectrum with all of this.
Well, and I think in modern society, modern society lends itself to that latter, right?
Yeah.
Like people sitting in their basement, being scared of everything, you know, not wanting to leave their home, you know, wearing a mask because they're scared of like it's crazy to me to watch people, you know, you see people in some cities and they're still wearing masks, you know, and it's just interesting because that is a fear-driven response. And you guys talked about earlier, like a lot of it comes from, you know, your childhood and what you grew up with. My parents operated out of fear. And so like me, I want to teach my kids boldness, especially now, because there is, Mike mentioned it last week, actually, on when we were talking. It's like Gen Z, they've said now, if World War III happened, they're like, I'm not going. I'm not going to fight. I'm not doing anything. I'm going to run away. You know what I mean? And like that's
which you might be on the doorstep of it.
Right? Depending on what happens, right? No. But it's interesting because, and so it's like our kids and even us as adults, as we get older, we have that propensity to want to have things secure. And so how do we continue to move? Because I do think that if you're not willing to take a little bit of risk, right? Like that inhibits you from really experiencing life to the fullest. Right. Like we all have an ideal life that we can live and lead. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is hampered by fear. Yeah. And so when I think of it, it's like, how do I, even for myself, how do I push myself and be bold and take on a little bit of risk that I know is going to yield a better outcome for myself, because I'm going to grow. Yeah. Because even if I fail, that's what I think it's important. Risk, if it's done right, the benefits are either you win and you get the thing you want, you get the outcome you want, or you don't get the outcome you want, but you have the opportunity to grow through that outcome. Mike, you were going to say something.
I'm curious about, where's mine? I'm curious about your guys' thoughts on this. On that same note,
we got a tricky question coming up.
No, it's not really tricky, because we're talking about like putting your kids in difficult situations and risk and all that. And you just mentioned resiliency. I'm like, I like the idea of trying to get your kids to fail a lot. Not like I'm going to set you up for failure, but I'm going to put you in a position where the odds are actually stacked against you. I will
Just
give
going
you
to trip them every day.
I'll give you the tools for it. I'll
Kick them out the door every single time.
There you go. No, it's more of the sense of like, I want to give you expose you to the tools that will help you succeed in this venue, but you are not fully prepared for this yet.
Yeah.
I didn't come up with this, but like, I didn't fail a lot as a kid, not because I was good at things, but I'm risk averse. That's affected me a lot. And then the resiliency really does come from your ability to, like JP said a little bit ago, is take that failure and know that the failure is not the end. It's what comes after you can also push through, right? That's kind of a paraphrasing of where you were going with that. And so at a young age, exposing your kids to minor failures and letting them see that, not only did you failed, cool. Was it a big deal? Not that big of a deal, because you're still alive, you're still here. And guess what? You get another crack at it.
Yep.
So we're going to try again. What can you do better? And that repetition of failure into success and then failure into success, I think that's one thing that helps build resiliency, because
100%.
it reinforces
100%.
what you were saying, is like, it reinforces that notion that like, I might not know what the exact outcome of my actions are going to be, but I know whatever they are, I will overcome them because I've done it before.
Yeah.
And so that's just my 2 cents when we're talking about kids.
One of my favorite things I've heard recently on this, I think it was, I'll need to look this up afterwards, but there was a study recently done on the outcomes of fear, right?
Yeah.
And it was basically, I can't remember who, like where it was. I'll look it up afterwards, maybe, hopefully. So, but it essentially the study was done on, I want to say it was they took 1,000 different people or something over a certain period of time, basically had them like explain their fears of what was happening, right? Of like, what's your greatest fear over the next 30 days? What's your greatest fear over the next day, the next week, whatever, right? Like, what do you think is the worst case scenario that's going to happen? And they had all these people go through and explain all the things. And they had them go through, like, with relationships, maybe it was like work or something, like, if I tell my boss that this happened, like, I'm going to lose my job, or like whatever it was, right? These people would go through and give responses to whatever their greatest fear was of like what was going to happen out of the next couple days, 90 days. They projected out a couple months, right? And after whatever time they went through, I want to say it was like 3 to 6 months or something like that. But after the time period that they set with this, they found that 85 to 90% of the fears never manifested, which basically means that like nobody, 90% of everything that everybody projected could potentially go wrong didn't happen. Now 10% of it did, right? So it's not 100%. We're not saying that like I was afraid of this and it's never going to happen. But when you think about it in those terms, like put yourself in those shoes and think about like how you operate life. And if you're sitting there making decisions based off of what you're worried about, right? Like 90% of the things that you're worried about are not going to happen.
Yeah.
So why not instead of living out of the assumption that 10% of the things that are going to happen, which is going to be accurate, 10% of things are going to happen. Yeah. Why not live out of the assumption that 90% of the time it's going to work out, and then the 10% of the time that it doesn't work out, figure it out.
Yep.
Like you've bought yourself 90% capacity mentally to deal with this stuff. So all those things that you were worried about, all those things that you were scared about happening, everything like that, the conversation you were having with your boss or your coworker or your family member or whoever it was, is 90% of the time not going to happen exactly the way you think it is.
Yeah.
Right? Like worst case scenario, it's going to happen better than you think it is.
Yeah.
Somewhere on the spectrum of better, right?
Yeah.
So why worry about it like that? So like when you talk about like when you especially when it like deals with kids and everything, it's, how do you equip them to approach life with an understanding, not just an understanding, but an expectation that life's going to work out and it's going to be fine. Like no matter what you do and how you handle this, it's going to be okay. So do whatever you think is right. Right. And that's the biggest thing is I think giving your kids like, how do you give your kids that inner compass of just being in that inner trust of things are going to be okay. I don't know what it's going to look like. It might look different, completely different than I think it's going to look like. Yeah. But how is it going to look like in the end? Don't worry about what it's going to look like in the end. Just do it and deal with whatever happens in the end, right? Most of the time, you're going to be dealing with that. And this is true for most people. Most of us can sit here and say, like, we had that coworker that we didn't want to have that conversation with, right? Yeah. that we were just kind of butting heads with and we were just kind of avoiding and stuff like that. And then I guarantee you, most of us would sit there and say like, oh yeah, I went, like if there was that moment that you had that conversation with that person, it was better than I thought it was going to be. It might not be perfect, but it was a lot better than you thought it was going to be.
Right.
And that's typically the overall concept of fear is fear is a projection of things that typically don't happen 90% of the time.
Yeah.
So how do you train your kids to sit there and say like, okay, like the second that I've got a concern or a fear about something, I'm not going to assume that it's going to happen. I'm going to assume that it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And if it does happen, then I'll just deal with it.
Yeah.
Because 90% of the time, I'm not going to be dealing with those problems. And 10% that I am. So
how do you guys think we can encourage each other and other guys? And like, how do you guys think we nurture that in others and ourselves even? It's $1 million question, right?
Well, I mean, the only thing I know is, like I said, go back to the same thing I do with my kids. I find what the boundary is for them, figure out what tools you need to push it a little bit, put myself in something that's slightly uncomfortable, survive that, move on.
Are you asking more of like, how do we introduce that into our lives or our kids' lives?
I think both.
I think it would be a general, like, I mean, one principle for a child should still technically it be able to extend into an adulthood.
I'll just say this is my opinion on it. And this is just recently developed over the last 6 months. I did not have this opinion 6 months ago. I'll just say this. Okay.
He's about to tell you you're wrong, Mike.
That's fine.
No, I'm not
the
telling you
number
wrong.
of times I'm wrong
I'm not
is
telling you
many.
Wrong. One of the greatest quotes I ever heard was, everything is downstream from the body, right? And I have not realized, I realize more and more every day how true that truly is in life. Is that everything, the first time I saw it and I really kind of like dwelled on it was an interview with who's the British dude that does the TV show?
Piers Morgan?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm
Piers
so
Morgan.
glad that you got that. That was, I mean, well done,
fantastic
Mike.
pen, dude, on that one. It was Piers Morgan and Chris Williamson. And
the guy with the face.
Yeah, the dude with the British accent in the face, like anybody. No, but Piers Morgan had an interview with Chris Williamson, who's like one of my favorite people on the earth. Best podcast I think I've ever listened to, Modern Wisdom. Plug for that one for sure. And he asked Piers Morgan, and I loved where Piers Morgan was coming from this, but he asked them, what's more important, mental health or physical health? And Chris Williamson said physical health, and Piers Morgan's like, no, mental health. Like, we've got a massive issue with mental health in this world. And Chris Williamson had such a it's one of my favorite responses I've ever seen. He's like, yeah, but everything's downstream from the body. If you got physical health, you got mental health and stuff like that. And he went on to expand about that. And it was basically like, if you take care of your body, if you're dieting well, you're exercising well, if you're like, because generally, if you sit there and talk about like, if you're taking in a ton of sugars, if you're taking in just junk food, stuff like that, you're feeding your brain the capacity of what it can handle, right?
Oh man, yeah.
And so if you're trying to sit there and say like, what's my ability? And I know this firsthand. This is the only reason why I completely as soon as he said it, I was like, this is 100% true, was because I had like a little college, not even a college kid, like a teenage kid diet for like 20 years. And
what? You can't tell by looking at him, but
no, I did. And so
I'm just thinking there's a lot of fruit snacks at that house usually, and
have you
not
seen?
anymore.
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
Not
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like the amount of crap that I was taking in for such a long period of time eventually led to like brain fog at work and lethargy and just an overall just like sense of just like constant being tired and exhausted, right? And as soon as I switched my diet up and my exercise up, I had energy, I had focus, I had like positive like mentality towards everything. And like it was a ripple effect. And so as soon as I started feeling that, I felt more happy and confident in who I am. I felt more energized. And then as soon as that happened, then all of a sudden the ripple effect happened of like, as soon as I started having like difficult things introduced in life, I was like, oh, like this is, I'm okay because I can handle this. Not because I can't handle this, because my experience was I couldn't handle that because I wasn't like, I was either tired or fatigued or like. And so again, going back to what I was saying, everything's downstream from the body, right? And so when we're talking about even just from like a parenting standpoint with this and stuff like that, I think it even extends beyond that, is because like when you are in a better in a better place physically, mentally, emotionally, everything, then you're no longer there's kind of like a switch that flips, right? And I feel like a lot of people, what they find themselves in, myself included, is when you don't have a good balance from a health standpoint in your life,
Yeah.
you're more taking on the world than you are impacting the world.
Oh.
And so what's happening typically is the world's kind of coming at you, and it's more about like, how do you divert? How do you kind of defend?
You're reactive, not proactive.
You're very reactive. Yes, exactly. And then as soon as you start taking control of that area of your life, then you stop being reactive, you start being proactive. So not only are you avert to like worrying about things that come at you,
Yeah.
but now you have like an increased ability to actually positively impact things. And so like with kids, I think a lot of it boils down to the better you are at maintaining yourself and who you are, the more responsive or the more impactful you'll be with them, right? It's easy to pick up on things. And I only noticed this just recently, was just because like I didn't realize until like just the past year, like how like I was always trying to manage the kids based off of how they were making me feel.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
And so it was very like, okay, like I'm agitated, like I'm overwhelmed.
Yep.
I'm kind of tired. I don't want to deal with this or anything like that. And so it was very just kind of like put walls up and like, hey kids, like if you come in this space, you're going to mess things up. I don't want to hurt you. Right. But if you come in this space, it's going to get really ugly really fast. So just give me space.
Kill you.
Yeah, exactly. But after that, it was like, oh, like you can come into my space because my space is very healthy. It's all good.
Yeah.
Come into my space. Like, what do you guys need? Like, what do you need? I can now pour out into you more than just trying to figure out like how much I can sustain you. Right.
Yeah.
So,
well, and that kind of comes full circle into what we talked about at the beginning, where as guys, it's kind of like, it's when we can create that bubble of safety by taking on some of that risk.
Exactly.
We then create an environment for our families and those who are involved with us to experience life better.
Yeah. The healthier your space is, the healthier everybody's space is.
That's good. Mike, any last thoughts?
No.
We got a timer.
Yeah, we got a timer on.
Big timer.
The big timer.
The big timer.
It's
yeah,
up.
I saw that.
The fries are done.
It ran out. It's wondering why I didn't reset it, most likely. But I just wanted to let you guys keep talking because
No, that's good.
It's it's guidelines.
Is it? The big timer's not. It popped up big timer, and I was like,
yeah.
I was like, once you chip this down, it's not gonna be an hour anyway. So.
No, it's not.
No, that's awesome. Dude, JP, thanks for coming on, man. This is fun. Guys, thank you for joining us. We'll catch you next time.
When this silent, you'll be alone, far from friends in life. You'll spend your evenings getting stoned to numb the ache inside.